Loti Tede, daughter of the Laguna Pueblo chief, appears around 1905 wearing kawaii ceremonial clothing with a wide belt and beaded necklaces. While the United States was racing into the 20th century, the village in central western New Mexico near Albuquerque kept preserving its own history. There, every detail of the clothing recalled a people older than the railroads. In the early 1900s, the artist Carl Wernz captured a simple moment in a Hopi village in Arizona. Two indigenous girls, leaning near the window, sharing the same silence and looking outside, while out there the American frontier was changing fast amid desert dust, adobe houses, and a life much tougher than ours, one many of our grandparents would still remember. In 1908, Roland Reed portrayed an Ojibwa woman on tribal land. In her face, you can feel the tension between the old world and the advance of the cities, a moment when everyday life becomes a record of how the history of native peoples changed. For many people today, it just looks like a still scene, but for anyone who pays attention, it's almost a forgotten album of how the United States was formed. In 1878, in an isolated garrison at Fort Keogh in the Montana Territory, a woman of the Cheyenne Nation faces the future after years of war with the United States Army. While soldiers guard the frontier and settlers push across the West, she carries in her expression the memory of a people who resist in silence, watching the buffalo disappear and the hunting routes turn into property. On top of a rocky mesa in Arizona, around 1900, an explorer named Frederick Monson watches a group of Hopi girls from the village of Sichomovi. They stand in a line in silence, wearing cotton dresses, dark shawls, and rolled hairstyles, symbols of tradition and of the passage from childhood to adulthood, while the young country was still exploring the West. In the early 1900s, in Isleta Pueblo, New Mexico, Carlota Chiwiwi sits with her daughters Maria and Felicita Tura. Traditional clothing, a steady gaze, and a baby in her arms remind us that the history of the United States was also written by indigenous families who held on to their culture during the country's expansion. While the West was changing, they stayed there, grounded in faith, work, and roots. In 1895, a native girl walks through Taos Pueblo, in what is now New Mexico, among adobe homes built long before the American nation itself. While the country races toward the 20th century, the pace there is still different. Simple living, old faith, and a part of the U.S. that barely showed up in the books. It's the kind of quiet scene that holds up the history of an entire country. In 1897, a woman of the Spokane Nation poses in front of Frank LaRoche, steady, as if carrying centuries of history on her shoulders. While the country rushed toward progress, she reminded in silence that this land had owners long before the American flag ever waved here, in the forests and rivers of the Northwest, when the Old West was still very real. In 1892, a young Kiowa woman faces the camera at a time when the United States government was pushing her people onto reservations. Her clothing, ornaments, and the steady way she stands tell of an older, resilient way of life, while the Old West was fading and the country we know today was taking shape. Behind that look, you can feel the clash between tradition and the advance of the frontier. At the start of the 20th century, in a Pueblo village in what is now New Mexico, a woman presents herself as the corn spirit. In the way she stands and in her ornaments, you can see the people's respect for this grain, which kept families alive on this land long before the United States flag appeared, and still today reminds us who truly rules the desert and the tables of many. In the 1880s, a woman of the Taos Pueblo people faces everyday life among adobe homes and the dust of the Southwest. Her clothing, the way she stands, and her steady look tell a story of faith, hard work, and resistance, reminding us that this land had owners long before the U.S. flag arrived. It's a direct reminder of the nation's deep roots. At the start of the 1900s, Carl Everton Moon traveled through the West, documenting the everyday life of different indigenous nations. He knew that the government and modern life were changing everything fast, and he wanted to preserve with respect signs of how these peoples lived, hunted, prayed, and raised their children before that routine disappeared. For him, that was part of America's history. In the 1880s, Marcia Pascal, daughter of Lieutenant Colonel George W. Paschal, an officer of the United States Army, grew up between two worlds. Her mother's Cherokee Nation and the country that was expanding with railroads, new laws, and conflicts over land, citizenship, and the future of America, while veterans still remembered the Civil War, and Washington tried to impose its order on the frontier. In 1900, a young indigenous woman appears wearing her people's clothing right at the turn of the century when the U.S. was growing fast and taking native lands. Her look reminds us that behind the nation's big achievements, there were whole communities fighting to hold on to their faith, language, and customs amid pressure from the new federal government, its laws, and the soldiers who arrived acting like they owned the land. In 1894, a woman of the Kiowa Nation lives between two worlds, the life of her ancestors, guided by rituals and the land, and the pressure of a government pushing forward with soldiers, laws, and missionaries. Every choice she makes shows how Native peoples fight to stay strong without losing who they are in the face of the new American order spreading across the Great Plains. In 1899, Frank Reinhardt captures Hattie Tom, an Apache woman, right at the end of the frontier era. While the country grows into a new power, she stands firm, holding the memory of a people who fought against the advance of the whites. Her image reminds any patriot that the history of the U.S. also runs through her, and through those who lost land, family, and voice in the building of the nation. In 1886, Lizzie Longwolf, a Plains native woman, joins Buffalo Bill's famous show. At the height of the Wild West myth, she travels across the country displayed as an exotic attraction, while the U.S. had already closed the frontier. Her life reminds us of the price Native peoples paid for the strong and free America that these men still defend as home. Elsie Vance Chestuan was born among the Chiricahua Apache, granddaughter of Chief Victorio, at a time when the U.S. government was pushing her people away from their hunting lands. Still a young girl, she was taken to the Carlisle School, came back sick, and died at Fort Sill. Her life reflects the harsh clash between the Apache Nation and American expansion into the West at the end of the 19th century. In 1895, a young Hopi woman poses in her people's clothing right in the transition of the U.S. from the West into the modern era. Her hair, the beads, and the fabric she wears tell a story of faith, family, and resistance at a time when the nation was changing way too fast around her. Looking at her is a reminder that long before borders and flags, these families were already standing strong on the same land. In 1886, we see Isabel Perico Njadi, a Chiricahua Apache woman held as a captive in a military campaign by the United States Army in the final years of the Apache Wars. Her serious face, simple clothing, and tied hair tell a harsh story of the Old West, when the government pushed entire tribes far from their lands on train trips to distant forts. In 1899, photographer Frank Reinhardt captures Hattie Tom, a Chiricahua Apache woman sitting with a steady look, wearing the traditional clothing and adornments of her people. Every detail of the fabric, the necklaces, and the hairstyle shows an indigenous way of life that still resisted the pressure of American expansion in the Old West. It's a quiet reminder of who was already there before the borders we know today. Around 1900, in the middle of the United States' rush toward progress, Alice appears sitting with a steady look, dressed in the traditional style of the Northwest. From the beads, the fabrics, and the objects around her, you can guess she might be from the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla people, who were trying to hold on to their customs even as the frontier was closing in on them. Around 1900, a young woman of the Hopi Nation appears on her wedding day on American territory, high in the Arizona desert. She wears her hair tied in side rolls, a dark outfit with light shawls and strands of shells and silver on her chest, while relatives around her watch in silence, certain that this union will protect the clan and the land of the ancestors. In 1885, a record shows a young woman of the Comanche Nation, right in the era of the American frontier. Her steady look, the braids, the beads, and the heavy fabric of her clothing tell of a people who defended their land while the country pushed west, before our grandparents were even born, with forts, wagon trails, and cattle trails changing those plains forever. In 1886, Julie Nelson appears with the same firmness of someone who watched the country grow after the Civil War. Her simple dress and straight posture reflect the hard life in small towns, when family, work, and faith were what kept people standing at the end of that century. In her serious look, you can imagine stories of sacrifice and pride for the land she called home. In the 1880s, between wars and the advance of the frontier, young Comanche women held the camp together. They took care of the horses, traded hides with white settlers, and taught their children the stories of the old warriors. Without them, that Plains nation wouldn't have survived the pressure from the United States, nor kept alive the pride of their ancestors. At the turn of the 19th century, the American George A. Addison shows Amy and Carrie in Kiowa, South Carolina, living that ordinary day every patriot values: family together, a simple routine, the sea in the background, and the feeling that the country is growing while they keep alive the memory of those who came before. You can feel a nation being built, guided by hard work and faith.